So we were talking about English as a lingua franca, and that is indeed the topic of this presentation. So let me start off with checking how much you remember from Rona's presentation. And to that end, there are two questions up here on the screen. If you can quickly give your estimates of what percentage of the speakers or the global population, in your opinion, can communicate in English? And then among those that can communicate in English, what is the proportion of non-native speakers versus native speakers? And that was something that Rona mentioned in her presentation. And let's now see the outcomes. Well, actually, English is only spoken by around 1/3 of the global population, so there are still a majority that do not speak the language. But among those that do, there are different estimates depending on the author that you check. And these range from 80% non-native speakers, 20% native speakers, to anything in the range of 92% non-native users and only 8% native users. And this disproportion is projected to still increase with time. And this has two consequences. One is that this world language is no longer shaped exclusively by native users. And the other is that in many cases, the only place where our learners may get in contact with native speakers may be the English language classroom. Then they may leave the classroom, they may go elsewhere and still use the language, but to other non-native users like themselves. So what happens in most of the cases, for most of the learners, is that they don't necessarily try to copy the conventions of what native speakers do with the language. Actually, there's often the expectation that our learners are going to become native speakers, but that has sometimes been likened to what is called the Spanish waiter paradox. Why the Spanish waiter? If you're familiar with the TV series 40 Towers, you may be familiar with Manuel, who's a waiter in a provincial hotel. And let's perhaps introduce Manuel for just a second.
You see, I speak English well. I learn it from a book. Hello, I am English. Hello. How are you, sir? I can speak English. Hello, Major. How are you today? I'm fine, thank you. It's a beautiful day today. Is it? Oh, yes, I suppose it is. Yes, I can speak English. I learned it from a book. Did you? Did you really? Oh, there you are, Faulty.
Yes, I'm just going to open up, Major.
Oh, fine. I say that's a remarkable animal you have there, Faulty. Where did you get it?
Samson's in the town.
Really? Well, was it expensive?
£12, I think.
Good Lord. Japanese, was it?
Canadian, I think, Major.
Yeah, I didn't know the Canadians was clever as that. My God.
He started early.
Now, Manuel does actually want to pass off for a native speaker, but for most learners today, that's not the goal. What they want is what Rona was telling about earlier today. That is, they want to preserve their identity while using the language for effective communication. So the processes that are affecting the English language, such as language spread, variation, and adaptability, are natural processes affecting any natural language. But in the case of English, these are actually additionally accelerated and intensified by the non-native users. Now, if you're zooming in from Europe, then you might have a hunch that English is not actually the most spoken native language on the continent, because that first place goes to German. But then if we add on people who are able to communicate in the language, irrespective of whether they are first, second, or third language users, then we can see that the German language is the runner-up, but it only can boast half the speakers that English has. And of course, different countries across Europe are more or less proficient in the language. There are numerous reasons for that state of affairs. On a global scale, it's a bit more difficult to estimate the numbers of speakers of different languages, but such estimates have been made. And here we can again see that English is at the top, closely followed by Putonghua and then Hindi. The difference, of course, is that the second and third languages on this list are typically quite confined geographically. So they have a lot of speakers, but in a certain area of the world. Otherwise, you won't really get a lot of mileage with that language elsewhere. So this is not a situation that is entirely novel, the English language serving as a bridge language. This began with the colonization in the 16th century, but it was only in the last couple of decades that this growth took on an exponential turn. And where we can see that for most learners, the goal of interaction is with other non-native users like themselves. And this is also what you can see in the connotations that people have with the language, or rather the connotations that they don't have with the English language. So Katja Lochtman carried out a very interesting study at Vrije Universiteit Brussels in Brussels. I just came back from there, where she asked students at the university about their associations they had with different languages. And students would typically have connotations. So thinking of French, they'd think of romanticism. German would evoke ideas of Ordnung and being organized and disciplined. Slavic languages had their associations, but not so the English language. Because for the students, the English language was not the language of the UK or of America or of Australia. To them, it was the language that they use with their classmates, foreign classmates. It's the language they use to speak to tourists. It's the language that they use when they themselves travel, rather than being chained to a particular culture. So English as lingua franca, or English as an international language, there are different preferences on the two sides of the Atlantic, and there are also some nuances, but generally the terms refer to any instance of the English language that arises when two persons communicate in the English language without having the same native language. And in the past, native speakers would be excluded from that kind of communication, but today there is consensus among researchers that native speakers can also partake in ELF interactions as long as they try to make themselves understood and as long as they make the effort to understand the interlocutor. Now, that does not always happen. So I'm going to recite a conversation between a room service and a guest in a hotel in Southeast Asia. This is a conversation that was brought to my attention first by Robin Walker several years ago. So that exchange went more or less like this. Money, room service. Oh, I'm sorry, I thought I learned room service. Right, room service, money, do you wish to order something? Yes, I like some bacon and eggs. How'd you like them? What? Eggs. How'd you like them? Pie, boy, poach? Oh, the eggs, how do I like them? Sorry, scrambled, please. How'd you like the bacon? Crisp? Crisp would be fine. Okay, and Santos? What? Santos, do you like Santos? I don't know, I don't think so. No, do you want toast? Look, I feel really bad about this, but I don't know what do you want toast means. Toast. Why do you want toast? How about English muffin with butter? English muffin, I've got it, I understand now. You were saying toast, fine. An English muffin would be just fine. With butter? No, just put the butter on the side. What? I'm sorry, I meant butter. Please put the butter on the side. Copy? I feel terrible about this, but copy, tea, milk. Coffee, yes, coffee, please, and that's all. 1 minute, Jodo, strangle eggs, crisp bacon, English muffin with butter, honey, side, and copy, all right? Whatever you say. Okay, thank you very much. You're welcome. All right, so that's how some conversations go. But it's not necessarily the reason that one of the persons is a native speaker and one of the persons is a not native speaker, as we're going to see. But first, let's interrogate a few terms out there. Let me just turn on the lights because otherwise I'm looking a bit ghostly here. I hope this is going to help. So if you were asked to define who a native speaker is, you could probably come with a few criteria. Some would be more, some would be less obvious. Regarding less obvious ones, let me give you another question. That is, please watch this short video and tell me what language Wang Ho Chang is a native speaker of. So here comes the video.
Found a funny South Korean. He's here with us tonight. I'm going to introduce you to him. Please put your hands together for Wang Ho Chang. Wang Ho Chang. Ladies and gentlemen, this is Wang Ho Chang. So, Wang Ho, thanks for coming out and being our special guest, our special weapon, if you will. Why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself to the beautiful people of Dubai?
안녕하세요. 나는 한국 사람이요. 나는 이름 원호 인속 일본 영원청.
I have no idea what he said, but here's what I'd like to do. I'm just going to give you the microphone, and I'd like you to entertain the people of Dubai. Maybe do a song and dance, if you will. Is that okay? Do you guys want to hear Wang Ho Chang? Want some? Okay. Wang Ho Chang, everybody. Okay, that's good. You'll be fine. Just go ahead and go. Just go right in the front. Right in the front. Wang Ho Chang, everybody.
وعدينا يا شو عدينا على بر الهوى راسينا أنا عمري معاك وهوايا هواك عدينا يا شو عدينا. ضحكت عليكم ولا لا؟ الصدمة اللي انتوا فيها عادي جدا بتصير معي كل يوم. كل يوم من حياتي الناس بنصدموا انه كيف واحد كوري بيحكي عربي، معقول؟ مرة كنت بالشغل راكب الاليفيتر، فتح الباب، دخلت وقفت، بفوت وراي واحد خليجي، فماشي وبتطلع مش عاجبه، يعني انه يا اخي طلع هذا شعره كيف واقف. قلت له مش فاهم يعني حلو ولا مش حلو؟ قال لي لا مرة حلو. على كل for all those who are non-Arabic speakers, I do apologize, but there's a Showtime initiative to launch stand-up comedy in Arabic. Hence my presence on stage. So yeah, big ups. So anyways, I'll introduce myself again. My name is Wang Ho. No joke. I swear. أظن أهلي لما إجوا بدهم يسموني إنه what shall we name him? Wang Ho, because it's funny in the States. It'll make for good comedy. Anyways, my name is Wang Ho. أبوي كوري، أمي فيتنامية، وعشت كل حياتي بالأردن.
All right, so what language is Wang Ho Chang a native speaker of? Well, we can see that this is not always an easy question to answer. Here's a fragment of a PhD dissertation defended in Switzerland last May, where you can see that the person's first language or the language that they were born with need not necessarily be their most proficient language or the language that they like best. So essentially, once a second or a third language creeps into the picture and that language becomes the person's dominant language, you have a trouble defining what language that person is a native speaker of. Let's say someone was born to a binational family in the UK, and then they moved away to another country when that person was 7 years old, and the language of that country became their dominant language. Would you say that they are still a native speaker of English, if that's not their dominant language? What if they moved when they were 12 years old? What if they moved if they were 15 years old? You have a problem. So the only foolproof criterion of defining a native speaker is if someone's monolingual, or if someone does speak other languages, but they are not at the same level of proficiency as the language they were born into and the one that they were brought up in and they're using today. Now, another term that is highly problematic is that of a proper, real, or standard English. Already back several centuries ago, people were complaining about the purity of the English language being contaminated by words from other languages. But the problem is that even if you wanted to voice those concerns, you needed to actually use words that were borrowed from the other languages, as indicated here in a green font. But basically, if you take a reference grammar, for instance, Randolph Quirk's A Comprehensive Grammar of the English Language, that's more or less this thick. It's 1889 pages, no exercises, it's just morphosyntax. There will be things in that book that many native speakers are unaware of. And there will also be things or linguistic phenomena used by native speakers that will not be in that reference volume. And here I'm not even venturing into what someone might call substandard varieties or generally varieties other than the one that is deemed the prestigious one, because speakers of those varieties will never be told that they're not legitimate users of those varieties. But when the same phenomena happen in the language classroom, then very often the teacher is going to tell the students that these are mistakes and that these should be corrected. So we can see a double standard there. Now, of course, the reason for that situation is that the English language today, as Rona mentioned earlier, is a pluricentric language. It doesn't have one common source. You have several national varieties, broad brush strokes, and then within those countries, you have sub-varieties that often are not actually mutually comprehensible, even within the same country. Some examples. Here are just a few terms that are used in cookbooks, recipes, menus in the English language on both sides of the Atlantic. And we can see the differences between the terms and how sometimes they may be actually bigger than just superficial ones. Here's an account of a story when a passenger flying from Australia on a US airline used an expression, third income, that is probably one of the first Australian expressions you're going to use. US presidents who would be visiting Australia would learn that expression and try to weave it into their speech. Now, when that expression was used by a passenger, a flight attendant thought that she was being offended. So when the aircraft landed, there were the police waiting for the passenger on the tarmac because the flight attendant didn't know that Australian expression. Even small words can mean something completely different in the UK and the US, for instance. Small words such as quite, the meaning can be quite different. And then even within one country, you can go a few miles and you're going to need a different word for a commonplace thing. For instance, the cake that you serve with afternoon tea. Basically, a few miles and you cross an isogloss and you're in an area that uses a different word for the same cake. And of course, the different words or the different dialects will come with different associated levels of prestige ascribed to them. Here's another account from the news where a guy from Liverpool got accosted by the police because people were thinking that the guy was drunk and he was in charge of a child, whereas he was just speaking the Liverpool dialect. And importantly, if you think of dialects or variants that you might consider prestigious, those are not the ones that are regarded as the most friendly or the most kind or the most funny or the dialects that people would like their date to speak. Every time you ask a different question with concerning the associations with the different variants, you will have a different response coming up as the preferred variant of choice. But most of the time, it's not going to be so-called received pronunciation, which in itself is a very problematic term, because if you read David Crystal, for instance, I highly recommend the presentation of his and his son Ben coming up this week, then you will find out that RP is used by fewer than 2% of the English population. Not the UK population, not the British population. Fewer than 2% of English men and English women use RP. And that means that if you're choosing that as your model of instruction for your students, you could actually be accused of teaching your students something that does not really exist. Even Queen Elizabeth, late Queen Elizabeth, didn't speak the same variant or the same accent in the latter stages of her life as she used to when she was younger. All right, so if it's not RP, then you might still want to choose a variant as your model. So where do you go? Okay, let's go for a country that has the highest number of native speakers of English. That's going to be the US. Now, the problem there is that if you look at a map of US dialects or American English dialects, and you look around the area of Boston, that's more or less where you would place Standard American, then you're going to see that that patch spreads a bit around, but it's by no means the most spoken variant of English in the US either. So it's by no means anything standard for the US alone. And then you may be familiar with those maps that show you which expressions are used to denote a certain object. Here you can see that if you want to buy a carbonated or fizzy drink or a soda in the US, then you need to know which word to use for that generic term, because it's not the same term that's going to be used on the coast of the Atlantic and on the coast of the Pacific and in the Midwest and in the South, because you need actually different terms for one and the same thing from one and the same company. So, but still, there's this deep-rooted idea and misconception that it's the native speakers that are the providers of standards, and therefore, if we go by this logic, that anything that diverges from that is going to be treated as errors. And the native speakerism is still often being sold of as a unique selling point. So the photo you can see here, I took that in a bookstore after I was guest teaching in Germany, and you can see how speaking like a native is actually treated as a unique selling point for that calendar there. Now, let me make an important aside here. Because quite a lot of us, of course, use language tasks with our students, and quite a lot of us are teaching classrooms where almost all the students, or even if not all the students, share the same first language. And then we are often tempted to give them tasks where they have to reach a certain goal, but we tell them that the goal must be achieved via the means of the English language, which may be a bit artificial. Because remember that for English as a lingua franca, the English language is used because you don't share the same first language with your interlocutor, so you resort to a bridge language. but sometimes there may not be enough motivation to really present a task to your students. Let me give you an example of where this was done in a manner that was not motivated well enough. So here you can see a task that was assigned to a student as homework. You're a Chinese immigrant in the US and you're supposed to write a letter home describing your experiences. So the student begins to write. And so on and so forth, right? I've been living here very poorly, and then they go on their account. Now the student did the task. You know, they're an immigrant back in the 19th century. They're probably not a Harvard scholar. And even if they were really highly educated in that language, why would they use that language to write to their family back in China, right? So we really need to think clearly and to motivate the tasks so that students can see that these are tasks that they themselves might have to navigate in the future rather than just perform the task in English for the sake of the task. Now, ELF, English as a lingua franca, can also be well placed in the paradigm of translanguaging, that is using the students or existing semiotic and linguistic resources that they have at their disposal. That means also all the other background languages that they speak. And it refers to the use of those languages both in the classroom and outside. As we're going to see later, successful communication in English as a lingua franca often includes terms from other languages if you know that your interlocutor may be familiar with those terms, even though they may not exist in English, but in the other languages. One more term that needs interrogating here is that of a language variety, because many people think that lingua franca is a language, or English as a lingua franca is a language variety. A lingua franca is a sociocultural construct that a language variety is a sociocultural construct that refers to a language that's used in a certain territory by people sharing a certain cultural background. Now, by definition, English as a lingua franca is used when someone leaves their speech community or someone comes to your speech community and you're using English as the common denominator. Now, if we want to find a term for the community of speakers that use English to that goal, then a better term than a language variety is community of practice. So the aim of interactions in English as a lingua franca is communicative efficiency or intelligibility, and that is different from grammatical correctness. So typical trademarks of successful ELF interaction are adding redundancy, repetition, over-regularization, translanguaging, so the inclusion of other languages, both at the level of the clause and the level of lexical items. Sometimes this may be innovation or terms that you invent because you think that they might exist in English because of the other languages that you know. And actually, sometimes those terms may not exist in English, but they may carry the message across. To make this a bit more tangible, here are a few aspects of syntax that characterizes successful ELF communication. And you might at this point be looking at that list and saying, so all very well what he's saying, but these are just a few examples of common mistakes in the English language. That's very true, but what distinguishes these from others is that when these happen, communication is typically successful, whereas with many other mistakes, and I'm going to show some examples, communication may break down. Now, in terms of pronunciation, Rona already mentioned the lingua franca core. This was research done by originally done by Jenny Jenkins, when she analyzed communication among second foreign language users of English, and then those aspects that were deemed crucial for international intelligibility were part of the core. Those that were outside or not crucial went outside. So let's see what is important to be successful in international communication. Consonants Not all languages have this full repertoire of consonants that the English language has, so these have to be learned. Importantly, though, with the exception of interdentals, and interdentals, the and the, are usually some of the most difficult consonants for learners of English because they are rare across the world's languages. Plus, often people are a bit ashamed of being seen with their tongue sticking between their teeth. But actually, if the sounds are approximated, for instance, to further or to tide, which actually happens a lot in Irish, often the context will suffice to disambiguate the message. What else is important? It's not so important whether you pronounce the consonants in the right place or the one that is expected. Let's say if you pronounce your t with the tip of your tongue at the alveolar ridge or at the base of your teeth or at the tip of your teeth, doesn't matter as long as it's obvious that it's a t. Aspiration, that's this puff of air accompanying unvoiced stops, that's important. Clusters. Many languages have only open syllables and have no clusters. In Polish, you can stack 5 consonants one after another. You can say pstryknąć. You have 5 consonants there. That's not a problem for us. But for many languages, it is a problem. What's the best solution there? If you want to simplify your task, that's the last item here, epenthesis. That is the insertion of a tiny vowel, imagine a schwa, in between the consonants to break up the cluster. I observed it myself among a naive speaker of English, so to say. So once after my lectures in Japan, I was taking a boat tour, and towards the end, the driver said, "Ruto basu stopu." What was the driver doing? Well, he was inserting vowels after the final consonants to break up the syllables and to make them open syllables. And everyone understood what he meant. In terms of vowels, vowel length is important, much more so than vowel quality. And then in terms of prosody or intonation, it's not important whether you stress the word on the last syllable or the penultimate syllable or the first syllable. What's more important is that you accentuate the key word in your message. Outside the core, you've got production of interdentals, exact quality of the vowels, weak forms. Weak forms will be important if your learners are going to be too exposed to native speaker speech or to highly fluent speech, because they have to be able to reconstruct the message. But weak forms are damaging to international intelligibility. Epenthesis, insertion of the small vowel, word stress, rhythm, these don't matter for international intelligibility. And then you can now go back and try to think about the classes that you may have taken and how much attention your teachers may have accorded to those classes and whether that was really worth the investment. Maybe attention had better been placed elsewhere. Because, and again, studies have shown that being a non-native speaker may actually, or speaking with a non-native accent may be more intelligible and more effective than speaking with a native accent. This comes from a study by one student of mine. Let's listen to this short exchange in the Housing Committee of the British Parliament and see how even Britons talking to other Britons may have a hard time understanding one another.
Mr. Speaker, I know from speaking to a number of parliamentary colleagues that there are still certain aspects of the estate, including the Northern Estate, that are not great for people with disabilities. Can I ask the honourable gentleman what work is being done to make sure that this place is more accessible, particularly for some of our colleagues who have a disability?
Here, here.
I'm sorry, it must be something to do with my Antipodean background. Could you please repeat the question, because I didn't follow it?
Well, very popular today. I'm saying that a number of parliamentary colleagues who have disabilities do find it quite difficult getting around certain parts of the state. Given that we're doing this refurbishment work, what can be done to make sure that those with a disability are able to move around more freely and the place is accessible?
I'm really sorry. Please, could you do it very slowly in an Antipodean English? Thank you.
Just give any old answer.
I think the answer might be helped if you can reply in writing when you're ready. Right, Chris.
Thank you, Mr. Deputy Speaker. I'll try it on the first go. Oh, no, can I? Because I'm Welsh, so God.
Right, so David Linden represents Glasgow, and he's evidently not understood by Paul Beresford, who spent a few decades of his life in New Zealand. So this is how Linden commented on Twitter later on. And of course, you will probably easily find videos of politicians using English as their second or the third language in being much more efficient and, importantly, being much more achievable role models for your students. Now, this doesn't mean that the task is necessarily much easier, because there are some competencies that need to be complemented and that weren't always there in the programs or syllabi. So instead of the culture of specific countries, what's more important is intercultural communicative competence. That is the awareness that other people may have different norms, expectations, routines. Strategy competence, that is what to do when communication breaks down and how to overcome that. Relations and building rapport. And instead of, again, national cultures, what is called small cultures. That is, for instance, if you have students who want to learn English because they want to work in an English-speaking hospital, then what's important for them is the culture of communicating in such medical settings. And I mentioned that it's not that anything goes. This comes from our own work, where you can see that the second item from the top, that is wrong word order or wrong tense choice, can actually contribute to communication breakdown. So it's not that anything goes. We need to know what works, and we need to know what really needs our attention as teachers. So it's not that English as a lingua franca is a bastardized language, and it's also not that it's an invented form of language. There were attempts in the past to construct languages for learning purposes, but those were always cases of one guy sitting down and writing down what they thought would work without really doing any actual research. So what's important here is that what's natural and frequent in native speaker usage may not necessarily be pedagogically useful as examples to learn from, and we may want to redefine authentic as not used by native speakers, but as used by experts. And one more important and I think valid point here, or notion here that's very useful, is that is a Swiss notion of functional plurilingualism. That is the recognition that when we speak multiple languages, each of the languages will be developed to a different extent and in different realms, because we need them for different goals. And to make this tangible, here you can see a pentalingual speaker raised in a Croatian household, but in Switzerland. And you can see that her listening and conversation skills are strongest in the language of the home and the language of the street, that is Croatian and Swiss German. But her reading and writing are strongest in Standard German. That's the language of schooling, because it's at school that you learn to read and write. And this is very characteristic for most multilingual speakers today. And it's very different from high-stakes mainstream exams such as Trinity, IELTS, TOEFL, Cambridge exams, where in order to get a certificate stating that you're at B2 levels, for instance, you have to be at B2 in speaking, listening, reading, writing, interaction, mediation. You fail a component, you don't get the certificate. But that's not the goal or the reality of most language learners today. So I'm not necessarily saying that we should offer ill-formed constructions, but we should offer our learners an informed choice, whether they want to invest time and energy and approximate native models, or whether they just want to be intelligible and successful in that communication. And typically as teachers, we always need to cut corners. So research from ELF can tell us what we can turn a blind eye to. This also means that we don't need to correct all the errors that may be too intimidating, plus the students may not yet be at a stage when they will be able to take in all that knowledge. So it's better to focus on those errors that are really communicatively important. And to complement our instruction with strategy competence, intercultural communicative competence, rapport building. So I'm going to finish off with very quickly showing you how this can be done. In the morning, I chose Cantonese and Putonghua examples. Today, now in this session, a different language. So I'm taking a list of problems that French speakers who are learning English have been shown to demonstrate in class, and then I'm going to filter that against what we know is important for ELF communication, and the paler the font, the less important an issue is. So I'm going to go through it very quickly because that's just a proof of concept, so to say. So you can see that there are quite a list of problems that speakers of French have when they're learning English. This is intimidating to know for learners and for teachers. So how can we ease the learning load? Okay, so now we're going to use some paler font for some areas, and we can see that some points practically disappear. Some are almost not there, but it's basically much more digestible, both for the teacher and for the learner. All right, so the last slide, if your students ask you what model they should be learning and whether they have to be grammatically correct, and if you want to encourage them to be flexible and to be courageous and to just engage in communication, you can, for instance, tell them a rap such as this one. Listen up, you all. I got a story to tell about language that's breaking down barriers like a spell. Perhaps it's not what you might know of, different from the standard for sure. Native speakers claim they got it right, but they just hold us back, keeping us in the fight. Language is dynamic, always changing and growing. They try to hold it back, but English keeps flowing. They want to tell us what's correct, what's not, but who made them the boss? Who gave them top spot? Society's power structure they try to keep in place, but English broke free in style and grace. When non-natives come together, they don't need no prescriptions. They can communicate with ease without fear of restrictions. For English today, it's clear to see, is well intelligible for you and for me. Fear not prescriptive standards. It's a language that bends. When used flexibly, borders it transcends. With each interaction, it develops and grows. A language for all, its flexibility shows. It's not about spelling or grammar that's correct. It's about understanding, making people connect. A language that's flexible, easy to adapt. The language of choice, a wave you can't stop. Every time it arises, unique in the way, unconfined by grammar Nazis, and yet it won't fail. So keep this in mind when you use this tongue. English as a lingua franca is for everyone. So thanks a lot for listening. If you're interested, there's a reference there and some links where you can get more resources for free. And if I could just use 10 more seconds, we're running a study where we're investigating students' perceptions of learning effectiveness online and offline. This takes around 17 minutes to complete. That's the link up there. It's a link for students. If you could share it out, would be very grateful. But otherwise, thanks again. I'm really loving the outpouring of reactions. It's much more so than in the morning, though. Then we also had a 4-digit number of participants, but I'm really loving this audience now being so energetic. So thanks, and
yes.
Happy to take comments, questions. Thank you.
Hello, Michał. Thank you very much. And yes, people are interacting a lot in the chat box and via the reactions. So we can see many emojis here. So amazing talk. And as you said, you built up on what Bruno started talking to us earlier. So many interesting insights and lots of technical information as well. So we can dig into this English as a lingua franca world. And yes, we have a few questions for you. So let me do it quickly here. Don't know if we have much time to go, but from Eduardo Osorio, some students always ask which is better, American or British English. And if they learn either, they will be able to understand an Indian or Australian speaker. What should be answered to these students, Michał?
Thanks. So the thing is that we always define accents by comparing them with what we know. So if I'm a, let's say, speaker of Spanish, and I was brought up in one area, then that accent will be the natural one for me and the neutral one for me, and then others will be different, or they will be marked, right? And the same with national varieties. You know, if you're brought up in the UK, then you'll be immediately be able to pick up that someone's not from the UK, but importantly, even within just one country, you have so many sub-varieties that may often be not mutually intelligible, as we've seen examples of today. So I wouldn't say that there's one variety that is much more comprehensible than others. What research has shown times and times again is that very often it's the non-native speakers that are more intelligible than native speakers, primarily because a lot of native speakers use plenty of weak forms and other reductions that make the speech hard to reconstruct. So very often the students will actually be much better understood, and also not only by non-native speakers, but also by native speakers than other native speakers. So I'm not sure that we should be asking the question, which native variant is the best. We should make our students aware of the fact that even native speakers, educated native speakers, have trouble comprehending one another. And then you can show them materials to make them aware of that. And then you can show them, for instance, videos of successful individuals who are successful in their careers or whatever goals they need the language for when they're not native speakers of English, right? So the role models would be experts, but experts in their domain, not experts in terms of being native speakers of the language.
Interesting. So, well, trying to sum up, I would say that intelligibility is something we need to look into, but also raise awareness, right? Raise awareness that there are so many variants and even sometimes inside one country or one territory, you're going to find for native speakers, lots of different variants. So let's just keep an eye out for all these variants and try to maybe understand them and expand our knowledge of these different possibilities, right?
Absolutely.